The Boeing 747-400 carved through 37,000 feet of crystalline air, its passengers blissfully unaware that somewhere in the forward cabin, tucked into seat 22C, sat a woman whose presence would soon rewrite aviation protocol forever. Dr. Katerina Phoenix Volkov appeared unremarkable, auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, reading glasses perched on her nose as she scrolled through a pediatric cardiology journal. The flight attendant who offered her pretzels saw only another academic heading to a medical conference in Geneva. She couldn't have known that the woman declining the snacks with a polite smile once commanded the most feared squadron in modern aerial warfare. The mystery began at 14:42 Zulu time, when air traffic control at Gander received an encrypted transmission that made seasoned controllers reach for phones they rarely used. Within minutes, NORAD's threat assessment board lit up like a Christmas tree. The Boeing 747, designated Swiss International Flight 792, suddenly appeared on every radar screen that mattered, tagged with classifications that sent ripples through defense networks spanning 3 continents. The woman in 22C had become the most important passenger in the sky. What nobody understood yet was how a retired Air Force major, one who'd been medically discharged 3 years prior after a training accident that left her with a titanium rod in her left leg, could trigger the kind of response reserved for heads of state. The encrypted message that started it all contained just 7 words: "Phoenix is airborne. Abort Crimson Tide immediately." Those words, transmitted on frequencies that hadn't seen traffic in over a decade, caused the Pentagon to implement protocols that existed only in theoretical briefings. As Katerina turned another page in her journal, completely absorbed in an article about innovative surgical techniques for infant heart defects, she had no idea that 4 F-22 Raptors were already scrambling from Elmendorf Air Force Base. Their pilots received briefings that made no sense: escort a civilian airliner carrying a passenger whose call sign alone could stop military operations in their tracks. The mission commander, Colonel Marcus Viper Chen, had heard whispers about Phoenix during his years at the Air War College. Stories that seemed too incredible to believe, about a pilot who could read aerial combat like others read sheet music, who turned impossible missions into textbook victories. But those were just stories, legends that grew with each telling in officer clubs around the world. The woman in 22C, adjusting her reading glasses and making notes about valve replacement procedures, couldn't possibly be the same Phoenix whose tactical innovations were still classified at the highest levels. Could she? The first sign that this wasn't just another transatlantic flight came when Captain Henrik Mueller received a transmission that made his co-pilot drop his coffee. Swiss 792 was being diverted to a military corridor normally reserved for presidential aircraft. The reason given was simply national security imperative. As Mueller acknowledged the new heading, he glanced back toward the passenger cabin, wondering which of his 312 passengers could possibly justify such extraordinary measures. In the cabin, Katerina finally looked up from her journal, sensing something had changed in the aircraft's rhythm. Her trained ear caught the subtle shift in engine pitch that indicated a course correction. For a moment, her hand moved instinctively toward where her squadron patch used to sit, a gesture so automatic she'd never quite managed to suppress it. Then she returned to her reading, unaware that her presence alone had just initiated the largest unscheduled military escort in peacetime history. The Boeing 747's wake turbulence stretched behind it like invisible threads, connecting past and present in ways that would soon become terrifyingly clear. Dr. Katerina Volkov, pediatric heart surgeon, sat quietly in 22C, while somewhere in the depths of memory, Major Phoenix Volkov began to stir. The sky held its breath, waiting for the moment when tourist and warrior would once again become one. Meanwhile, in a bunker 3 miles beneath Cheyenne Mountain, analysts stared at satellite feeds showing an unusual formation developing in international airspace. The Swiss airliner had attracted attention from aircraft bearing markings that didn't appear in any official registry. Someone wanted Phoenix back in the game, and they were willing to risk everything to make it happen. Colonel Chen's voice crackled through his squadron's encrypted channel. "Raptor Flight, this is Viper. We have multiple bogies approaching from the northeast, bearing 045. They're not squawking friendly, and they're definitely not commercial traffic." His F-22 banked gracefully toward the threat, afterburners painting contrails against the Arctic blue. "Maintain radio silence and follow my lead. Whatever's happening here, that civilian aircraft is now our primary concern." The woman in seat 22C felt the familiar tingle at the base of her skull that used to herald combat engagements. For 3 years, she'd convinced herself it was just phantom nerve pain from her leg injury. But as Swiss 792 subtly changed course again, and the subtle vibration of nearby jet engines reached her ears, Katerina Volkov began to realize that some calls to duty never truly end. The sky was calling Phoenix home, whether she wanted to answer or not. 8 unidentified aircraft approached from multiple vectors, their intent unclear but their capabilities undeniable. The woman who'd once made aerial warfare look like artistry was about to discover that retirement from the military doesn't always mean retirement from war. As her fingers unconsciously drummed against her armrest in the precise rhythm she'd once used to coordinate strike packages, the greatest aerial engagement of the 21st century was about to begin. In the cockpit, Captain Mueller received another transmission that made him question everything he thought he knew about routine commercial aviation. "Swiss 792, this is Colonel Chen, United States Air Force. You are now under military escort. Maintain current heading and altitude. Do not deviate from course for any reason." The captain's hands tightened on the controls as he acknowledged the transmission, his voice steady despite the questions racing through his mind. Dr. Katerina Volkov, still reading about pediatric cardiac procedures, had no idea that her mere presence on this flight had just triggered the largest aerial response since September 11th. But deep in her subconscious, Major Phoenix Volkov was beginning to wake up, and when she did, the world would remember why some call signs become legend. The woman in 22C was about to become the most important person in the sky, whether she wanted to be or not. As the first enemy aircraft appeared on the horizon, their sleek silhouettes cutting through high-altitude clouds like sharks through water, Colonel Chen realized he was facing technology he'd never seen before. These weren't standard military aircraft. They moved with an otherworldly grace that defied conventional aerodynamics. His targeting systems couldn't lock onto them, and their radar signatures flickered in and out of existence like ghosts. "Raptor Flight, we have a problem," he transmitted to his squadron. "These bogies are using some kind of advanced stealth technology." The mysterious aircraft began to close distance with Swiss 792, their intentions becoming increasingly clear. They weren't here to intercept or escort. They were here to capture. The woman in 22C represented something valuable enough to risk international incidents, advanced aircraft, and the lives of everyone aboard the commercial flight. As Katerina turned another page in her medical journal, completely absorbed in surgical techniques that could save children's lives, she remained unaware that her own life, and the lives of 300 other passengers, now hung in the balance. Colonel Chen's F-22 Raptor screamed through the sky at Mach 1.8, its pilot's heart racing as he prepared for combat unlike anything he trained for. The enemy aircraft were definitely hostile now, vectoring in on the Boeing 747 with predatory precision. "Swiss 792, this is your military escort. Prepare for evasive maneuvers. We're going to get you out of here." But even as he spoke the words, Chen knew that a loaded passenger jet couldn't outmaneuver purpose-built combat aircraft. Whatever was about to happen, it would be decided in the next few minutes. In seat 22C, Katerina suddenly looked up from her journal, her combat-trained instincts finally overriding 3 years of civilian conditioning. The aircraft's subtle movements, the change in atmospheric pressure, the almost inaudible whine of military-grade engines. It all combined to trigger memories she tried so hard to suppress. Her hand moved to the small scar on her neck, hidden beneath her collar, where a piece of ejection seat shrapnel had nearly ended her career and her life. The Phoenix was awakening, and with her came skills that could either save everyone aboard Swiss 792 or doom them all. As the first missiles streaked across the sky like deadly comets, leaving contrails of smoke and fire in their wake, 312 passengers aboard a routine commercial flight were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks the most ordinary. Dr. Katerina Volkov was about to remember why they called her Phoenix, because from the ashes of her broken body and shattered career, something far more dangerous was about to rise. The aerial battle that would reshape modern warfare was about to begin, and at its center sat a woman reading about how to fix children's hearts, unaware that she was about to need every skill she'd ever learned to keep those hearts beating. The mystery of Seat 22C was about to be solved in the most spectacular and terrifying way possible. Captain Mueller felt his aircraft shudder as something passed uncomfortably close to his starboard wing. Through his headset came Colonel Chen's urgent voice. "Swiss 792, we have multiple missile locks on your position. I need you to follow my instructions exactly. Bank left 30 degrees and begin a controlled descent to flight level 300. Do it now." The captain's military training from his youth kicked in, and he executed the maneuver with precision, even as his mind raced to understand how a routine flight to Geneva had become a combat zone. In the passenger cabin, coffee cups rattled and reading lights flickered as the Boeing 747 banked sharply. Most passengers assumed it was turbulence, but Katerina knew better. Her body had been hardwired to recognize the signature movements of combat flying, and every instinct she possessed was now screaming warnings. She closed her journal and unbuckled her seatbelt, moving with the fluid grace of someone whose reflexes had been honed by years of high-G maneuvers and split-second decisions. Colonel Chen's Raptor rolled inverted and dove toward the approaching enemy formation, his wingman following in perfect synchronization. The enemy aircraft were unlike anything in his intelligence briefings, sleek, angular shapes that seemed to bend light around them, making targeting almost impossible. "Phoenix Flight, this is Viper. We are weapons hot. Engage at will." The radio crackled with acknowledgments as 4 of America's most advanced fighters prepared to defend a woman who didn't even know she needed defending. The first enemy aircraft fired, and Colonel Chen watched in fascination and horror as the missile seemed to think for itself, adjusting course with impossible agility as it streaked toward Swiss 792. His countermeasures engaged automatically, filling the sky with chaff and flares, but this wasn't a normal missile. It was something far more advanced, something that suggested their adversaries had access to technology that officially didn't exist. Katerina felt the Boeing 747 lurch as Captain Mueller threw the massive aircraft into another evasive maneuver. Around her, passengers were beginning to panic, their voices rising in confusion and fear. But she remained calm, her mind automatically calculating vectors and probable threats based on the aircraft's movements. 3 years away from combat hadn't dulled her tactical instincts. If anything, they seemed sharper now, honed by the civilian emergency medical work that had taught her to stay calm under pressure of a different kind. The woman who had once been Major Phoenix Volkov stood and moved toward the cockpit, her limp barely noticeable as adrenaline overrode the chronic pain in her leg. She had no official authority here, no rank or credentials that would grant her access to the flight deck. But she had something far more valuable, knowledge that could save everyone aboard this flight, if only she could convince the crew to let her help. As enemy missiles streaked past the aircraft's wings like deadly fireflies, and Colonel Chen's fighters engaged in aerial combat that pushed the boundaries of physics and human endurance, The passenger in seat 22C was about to step back into a world she'd tried to leave behind. The sky was calling Phoenix home, and this time, there would be no walking away from the flames. The greatest aerial engagement in modern history was just beginning, and at its center was a woman who'd spent 3 years trying to forget she was a weapon of war. Dr. Katerina Volkov approached the cockpit door with steady steps, even as the aircraft bucked and rolled around her. She knocked with the precise rhythm that military pilots use to identify themselves: 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. Through the reinforced door came Captain Mueller's voice. "This is the flight deck. Identify yourself." Her response was quiet but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command. "Captain, this is Major Katerina Volkov, United States Air Force, retired. I need to speak with you immediately." The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Then the cockpit door opened, and Captain Mueller saw something in the woman's eyes that made him step aside without question. Katerina entered the flight deck and immediately began scanning the instruments, her trained gaze taking in airspeed, altitude, heading, and fuel status in a single sweep. "Captain, how much combat maneuvering experience do you have?" she asked, her voice calm despite the chaos erupting around them. Outside the Boeing 747's windows, the battle raged in 3 dimensions. Colonel Chen's F-22 Raptors twisted through the sky in aerial ballet that would have been beautiful if it weren't so deadly. Missiles crossed their vapor trails like lethal calligraphy against the blue canvas of the high atmosphere. The enemy aircraft, sleek, predatory shapes that seemed to mock conventional physics, pressed their attack with relentless precision. "Swiss 792, this is Colonel Chen. I need you to listen carefully. We're going to execute a tactical descent through the cloud layer. When I give the word, push your nose down and don't level off until you reach 20,000 feet. Can you do that?" Captain Mueller looked at Katerina, and she nodded. Her hands moved to the controls with the confidence of someone who'd flown in conditions far worse than this. The first enemy aircraft broke through Colonel Chen's defensive perimeter, its weapons systems locked onto the commercial airliner. Time slowed as Katerina watched the targeting laser paint the cockpit, remembering another time, when she'd made a choice that ended her military career but saved dozens of lives. History was repeating itself, but this time, she was on the other side of the equation. "Phoenix," she whispered to herself, and for the first time in 3 years the name felt right. Dr. Katerina Volkov, pediatric heart surgeon, stepped aside as Major Phoenix Volkov, tactical genius and combat pilot, took control. The woman who'd once turned impossible odds into legendary victories was about to prove that some skills never fade. They just wait for the right moment to burn bright again. The Boeing 747 dove toward the cloud layer like a falling star, its 300 passengers trusting their lives to a commercial pilot and a retired Air Force major who'd been reading about heart surgery just minutes before. Above them, the sky erupted in fire and steel as the greatest aerial battle of the modern era reached its crescendo. Phoenix was flying again, and the heavens themselves seemed to tremble at her return. As Swiss 792 plunged through the cloud layer at angles that tested the structural limits of civilian aircraft, Katerina's hands moved across unfamiliar controls with muscle memory that transcended the differences between military and commercial cockpits. Captain Mueller watched in amazement as the retired major coordinated their descent with Colonel Chen's fighters above, using radio protocols he'd never heard but somehow understood perfectly. The enemy formation regrouped and followed them into the clouds, their advanced sensors cutting through the white veil like searchlights. But Phoenix had fought in conditions like this before, and she knew that sometimes the best defense was to become one with the elements themselves. The Boeing 747 disappeared into the cloud layer, its radar signature masked by millions of water droplets, while above, 4 F-22 Raptors bought precious seconds with their lives on the line. Colonel Chen's voice crackled through the radio. Phoenix, if you can hear me, we're running low on fuel and ammunition. Whatever you're planning, it needs to happen now." The woman at the controls of Swiss 792 smiled grimly, remembering the last time someone had told her that something was impossible. That time, she'd saved a city. Today, she'd settle for saving a plane load of innocent people and the brave pilots who'd risked everything to protect them. As the clouds parted and the ocean stretched endlessly below, Katerina Volkov prepared to show the world why legends never truly die. They just wait for the right moment to rise from the ashes. The Phoenix was flying again, and heaven help anyone who tried to clip her wings. The final phase of the battle was about to begin, and this time she held all the cards. The Boeing 747 burst from the cloud layer like a breaching whale, its massive form defying gravity through sheer determination, and the steady hands of two pilots who refused to surrender. Behind them, the pursuing aircraft emerged in perfect formation, their alien technology gleaming in the afternoon sun. But Phoenix had led them exactly where she wanted them, over international waters, away from populated areas, where the rules of engagement became much simpler. Colonel Chen's Raptor dove from above, using the sun as cover as he lined up his shot on the lead enemy aircraft. His targeting computer finally achieved lock, and his AIM-120 AMRAAM missile streaked across the sky like a guided thunderbolt. The enemy pilot, confident in his technological superiority, never saw it coming. The first kill belonged to the United States Air Force, but it wouldn't be the last. Swiss 792, this is your escort. We're going to try something that's either brilliant or completely insane. Katerina keyed the radio and responded in a voice that carried across the airwaves like a challenge. "Colonel, this is Phoenix. I've been insane my entire career, and it's worked out pretty well so far. What did you have in mind?" The plan that emerged in the next 60 seconds would have been rejected by any sane tactical planning committee. It involved using a commercial airliner as bait, 4 cutting-edge fighters as shepherds, and the flying skills of a woman who'd been medically retired for reasons that suddenly seemed less important than they had that morning. It was audacious, dangerous, and completely impossible, which made it exactly the kind of plan Phoenix specialized in. As the enemy formation closed for what they believed would be the final attack, they had no idea they were flying into a trap laid by the most dangerous pilot of her generation. The woman in the cockpit of Swiss 792 was no longer reading about heart surgery. She was about to perform surgery on the sky itself, cutting out the cancer that threatened innocent lives with the precision of a master surgeon and the ruthlessness of a warrior. The Pacific Ocean stretched beneath them like a vast blue canvas, waiting for the signature of legends to be written across its surface in contrails and fire. Phoenix was about to remind the world that there are some fights you simply don't pick with ghosts who refuse to stay dead. The enemy aircraft spread into an attack formation that would have overwhelmed any conventional defense, their pilots confident that superior technology and numbers would carry the day. They had studied Major Phoenix Volkov's historical combat records, analyzing her tactics and developing countermeasures for her signature maneuvers. What they hadn't counted on was that legends evolve, and the Phoenix who emerged from 3 years of civilian life was not the same pilot who'd been forced into retirement. Katerina's fingers danced across the Boeing 747's controls with surgical precision, each input calculated to maintain the illusion of a wounded bird limping toward safety. Behind them, the pursuers matched their speed and altitude, moving into position for synchronized strikes that would overwhelm any possible defensive response. Colonel Chen's Raptors maintained loose formation around the commercial aircraft, their pilots trusting completely in a plan they didn't fully understand. "Execute Phoenix Protocol," she transmitted on the encrypted frequency, using authentication codes that officially didn't exist. Somewhere in the depths of military communications networks, automated systems that had lain dormant for years suddenly came alive. Satellites adjusted their orbits minutely, early warning systems recalibrated their sensors, and naval assets thousands of miles away began tracking toward predetermined coordinates. The trap was more elaborate than anyone realized. Phoenix hadn't been randomly selected for this flight. She'd been deliberately placed aboard Swiss 792 by intelligence agencies playing a game whose rules stretched far beyond aerial combat. The woman who'd spent 3 years saving children's lives had been turned into bait for enemies whose existence was known only to a handful of people with clearances higher than most cabinet members. As the enemy formation moved into final attack position, their targeting computers locked onto Swiss 792 from multiple angles, ensuring that no evasive maneuver could save the massive aircraft. The commercial flight's passengers felt the subtle vibrations of weapons radar painting their aircraft, though few understood what those sensations meant. In seat 22C, now empty, a medical journal lay open to an article about surgical techniques for correcting complex congenital heart defects. Colonel Chen's voice cut through the radio chatter. "Phoenix, they're in position. Whatever miracle you're planning, we need it now." The response came back immediately, calm and confident. "Colonel, have you ever seen a phoenix rise from the ashes? It's spectacular, but first, you have to let the fire burn." The Boeing 747 suddenly rolled inverted, a maneuver that should have been impossible for a commercial aircraft loaded with passengers and fuel. But Phoenix had spent 3 years studying not just heart surgery, but also the structural engineering that went into modern aircraft design. She knew exactly how much stress the airframe could handle, and she was about to test those limits in ways Boeing had never intended. The pursuing aircraft found themselves flying through debris that hadn't been there seconds before, chaff and flares deployed from pods that civilian aircraft weren't supposed to carry. But Swiss 792 had been modified during a routine maintenance cycle months ago, equipped with defensive systems by technicians who'd been told they were installing communications equipment. The ghost of Major Phoenix Volkov had been planning this engagement long before she knew she was planning it. As enemy missiles streaked through the sky, their advanced guidance systems confused by countermeasures that matched their own technology, the woman at the controls of Swiss 792 began to show the world what 3 years of saving lives had taught her about the value of survival. Every child's heart she'd repaired had reminded her that miracles were just another word for refusing to give up when logic said you should. The first enemy aircraft exploded in a ball of fire and metal, its pilot never understanding how his technologically superior fighter had been outmaneuvered by a commercial airliner. The Phoenix was teaching the next generation the same lesson she'd taught their predecessors. In aerial combat, the pilot matters more than the machine, and some pilots burn too bright to ever truly be extinguished. Colonel Chen watched in amazement as the Boeing 747 performed maneuvers that redefined his understanding of what was possible. The woman controlling that massive aircraft wasn't just flying, she was conducting a symphony of destruction, using physics and intuition in equal measure to turn hunters into prey. This wasn't the same Phoenix from the history books. This was something new, something evolved, something that 3 years of healing had transformed into a force of nature. The second enemy aircraft fell to Colonel Chen's wingman, its stealth technology useless against tactics that treated modern aerial combat like three-dimensional chess played at supersonic speeds. The remaining enemy pilots began to realize they'd been lured into a confrontation they couldn't win, but retreat was no longer an option. They'd committed to this attack, and now they had to see it through to its inevitable conclusion. High above the Pacific, the legend of Phoenix was being rewritten in fire and steel. The woman who'd once been forced into retirement was proving that some stories never end. They just wait for the right moment to begin their next chapter. The sky had called its daughter home, and she was answering with the voice of thunder and the grace of someone who'd learned that true strength comes from knowing when to fight and when to heal. Swiss 792 climbed through the afternoon sky like a resurrection, its impossible maneuvers leaving contrails that painted victory across the blue canvas of heaven. Behind it, the scattered remains of an enemy formation that had underestimated the power of legends fell toward the ocean like falling stars. The Phoenix had risen again, and the world would never be quite the same. As the last enemy aircraft disappeared in a fireball that briefly rivaled the sun, an unusual quiet settled over the radio channels. Colonel Chen's Raptor formation assumed standard escort positions around Swiss 792, their pilots still processing what they'd just witnessed. The Boeing 747 leveled off and resumed normal flight characteristics, as if the previous 30 minutes of impossible aerial combat had been nothing more than a minor deviation from the flight plan. Captain Mueller looked at the woman beside him with a mixture of awe and confusion. Dr. Katerina Volkov was calmly reviewing post-flight checklists, her hands steady as she helped restore the aircraft to normal civilian operations. Only the slight tremor in her left hand, a legacy of old injuries that never quite healed, betrayed the stress of what they'd just survived. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. She glanced at him with tired eyes that held depths he couldn't fathom. "I'm a pediatric heart surgeon who missed her connecting flight," she said with a small smile. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor about these things. But as she spoke, her hand unconsciously touched the scar on her neck, and Captain Mueller understood that some questions were better left unasked. In the passenger cabin, flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisles, calming rattled nerves and checking for injuries. Most passengers attributed the unusual flight characteristics to severe turbulence, and they were content with that explanation. Only a few had caught glimpses of the aerial battle through their windows, and they found their accounts dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations by fellow travelers who preferred mundane reality to uncomfortable truth. Colonel Chen's voice filled the cockpit one final time. "Swiss 792, this is your military escort. We're being recalled to base. It's been an honor flying with you, Phoenix." Katerina keyed the radio and responded in a voice that carried across the airwaves like a benediction. "The honor was mine, Colonel. Take care of yourselves up there. The sky needs guardians like you." The F-22 Raptors peeled away in perfect formation, their contrails writing a farewell message across the sky before they disappeared toward the horizon. Swiss 792 continued its journey toward Geneva, carrying 312 passengers who would never know how close they'd come to becoming casualties in a war most people didn't know existed. As the Boeing 747 approached European airspace, Katerina Volkov made her way back to seat 22C, where her medical journal waited exactly where she'd left it. She settled into her seat, adjusted her reading glasses, and returned to the article about pediatric cardiac surgery that had been interrupted by history. Around her, fellow passengers dozed or watched movies or worried about connecting flights, blissfully unaware that the woman reading about heart surgery had just saved all their lives. The flight attendant who'd offered pretzels earlier stopped by her row. "Everything all right, Dr. Volkov? I noticed you were up during that turbulence." Katerina looked up from her journal and smiled. "Everything's fine now," she said quietly. "Just checking on some old friends." The attendant moved on, satisfied, while the woman in 22C returned to her research on surgical techniques that could give children normal lives. 3 hours later, Swiss International Flight 792 touched down at Geneva International Airport with a landing so smooth that passengers applauded the crew's skill. As they disembarked, Dr. Katerina Volkov limped slightly as she made her way through customs, just another medical professional attending another conference. Her passport bore no unusual markings, and her luggage contained nothing more threatening than surgical textbooks and conference materials. But somewhere in the deepest vaults of military intelligence, a file marked Phoenix Protocol was quietly updated with new information. The woman who'd been medically retired from active duty had just proven that retirement was merely a state of mind. The legend was alive and well, hidden in plain sight among the civilian population, ready to answer when the sky called her name. The final entry in the classified after-action report would be brief and understated, as such reports always were. Civilian asset performed within expected parameters. Threat neutralized with minimal collateral damage. Phoenix protocol remains viable. But between those clinical lines lay a story that would be whispered in pilot training schools for generations. The tale of a tourist in seat 22C who turned a routine flight into the stuff of legend. Dr. Katerina Volkov, pediatric heart surgeon, disappeared into the crowd at Geneva International Airport, carrying surgical instruments that would save children's lives in the days ahead. Major Phoenix Volkov, aerial combat legend, faded back into the shadows of classified history, waiting patiently for the next time her unique skills would be needed. The sky had called its daughter home, and she had answered. Now it was time to return to the quiet work of healing, secure in the knowledge that some callings never truly end. They just wait for the right moment to ignite the heavens once again. The woman in seat 22C had reminded the world that heroes don't retire. They just change uniforms and find new ways to serve. The phoenix had risen from the ashes of her broken career and emerged stronger than ever, proving that sometimes the most ordinary-looking people carry the most extraordinary secrets. In the end, that's what makes legends timeless. They hide among us, reading medical journals and saving lives one heart at a time, until the moment comes to spread their wings and remind the world why some call signs become immortal. 24 hours later, in a small conference room at CERN, Dr. Katerina Volkov presented her research on minimally invasive techniques for correcting complex congenital heart defects. Her audience of distinguished cardiac surgeons listened intently as she described new approaches that could reduce surgical trauma and improve outcomes for pediatric patients. None of them knew that the calm, articulate woman at the podium had spent the previous afternoon engaged in aerial combat that pushed the boundaries of human possibility. During the coffee break, a young resident approached her with questions about a particularly challenging case. As Katerina explained the intricacies of valve replacement in newborns, her hands moved with the same precision that had controlled a Boeing 747 through impossible maneuvers just hours before. The skills were different, but the dedication to preserving life remained constant. Whether she was saving a plane load of passengers or repairing a child's heart, the woman they called Phoenix had found her true calling, guardian of those who couldn't protect themselves. High above the Swiss Alps, Colonel Marcus Chen's F-22 Raptor cruised at 40,000 feet, its pilot lost in thought as he flew routine patrol patterns. The previous day's engagement had been classified at levels that made it officially non-existent, but Chen knew he'd witnessed something extraordinary. The woman in that commercial aircraft had displayed flying skills that redefined his understanding of what was possible, transforming a hopeless situation into tactical victory through pure force of will and unmatched expertise. In his post-mission debrief, Chen had tried to explain what he'd seen, but the words seemed inadequate. How do you describe watching a Boeing 747 perform maneuvers that should have torn it apart, guided by a pilot who treated physics like suggestions rather than absolute laws? The classified reports would record the facts, but they could never capture the artistry he'd witnessed. Aerial combat elevated to the level of ballet, deadly and beautiful in equal measure. The radio crackled with routine traffic control instructions, but Chen barely heard them. His mind was still processing the voice that had guided their formation through the most complex aerial engagement of his career. The woman they called Phoenix had coordinated 4 F-22 Raptors and a commercial airliner like pieces on a chess board, sacrificing pawns to protect the king while simultaneously putting the enemy in checkmate. It was strategic thinking on a level they didn't teach at the Air War College. As his Raptor banked through a lazy turn above the mountains, Chen wondered if he'd ever see Phoenix in action again. Part of him hoped not. Civilian life had clearly been good to her, and she deserved the peace she'd earned through years of service and sacrifice. But another part of him, the part that lived for the adrenaline rush of aerial combat, hoped that somewhere in the world's trouble spots, the Phoenix was still flying, still turning impossible odds into legendary victories. Dr. Katerina Volkov concluded her presentation to enthusiastic applause, her research representing genuine breakthroughs in pediatric cardiac care. As she packed her materials, several colleagues approached with invitations to collaborate on future projects. She accepted graciously, already envisioning the children whose lives might be saved through their combined efforts. This was her real mission now, not the dramatic combat of her military years, but the patient, methodical work of advancing medical science one discovery at a time. That evening, in her hotel room overlooking Lake Geneva, Katerina sat by the window and watched aircraft trace their paths across the darkening sky. Commercial flights mostly, following established air corridors as they carried passengers between cities. But occasionally, she spotted the telltale contrails of military aircraft, their pilots practicing the ancient dance of aerial warfare in skies that looked peaceful, but remained contested territory for those who understood the deeper currents of global politics. Her laptop chimed with an encrypted message that appeared to be routine conference follow-up, but contained information that made her pause. Intelligence analysts had identified the technology used by their attackers, and the implications were troubling. The aircraft that had pursued Swiss 792 represented advances that suggested someone had achieved breakthroughs in materials science and propulsion systems that officially didn't exist. The woman who'd retired from active duty suddenly realized that retirement might be a luxury the world couldn't afford. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, Dr. Katerina Volkov had a different kind of mission, reviewing case files for pediatric patients whose hearts she might be able to repair, whose lives she could save through surgical skill rather than tactical brilliance. The Phoenix might rise again when the world needed her, but for now, she was content to heal rather than fight, to build rather than destroy, to nurture the next generation instead of battling the demons of the current one. Outside her window, the lights of Geneva twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing lives being lived, dreams being pursued, hearts beating steadily in chests that might one day need her help. The woman in room 847 closed her laptop and prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. The sky would always call to Phoenix, but tonight, the earth claimed Dr. Katerina Volkov, and she was exactly where she needed to be. As she drifted toward sleep, Katerina's last conscious thought was of the young patient she'd be operating on next week, a 6-month-old girl born,